So in this video I'm going to show you how to add data filters on an input connector. So what I've done is I've set up the MySQL connector here, and I've configured it with a database and a table and specified a set of rows that are on that table. And now we're going to look at adding the actual data filters on the connector to control what records get synchronized on the pipeline. So first of all, you need to consider that all input connectors support defining a set of filtering rules. Okay, these rules are used to control the data records that are synchronized on that pipeline, i.e. the records that get filtered out or get synchronized through. We're using the reason why we're using the MySQL input connector is simply because if you understand how to use filters for any of the database input connectors, so not just MySQL but Oracle, Postgres, and the other database connectors, then you'll have no problem using or specifying filters for any of the other connectors. It's more straightforward for the other connectors. The difference between adding filters on a database input connector like MySQL versus an input connector to a SaaS service like Salesforce, for example, is simply down to the reasons why you need to add the filters. So for an input connector like Salesforce, you only have one thing to consider when adding filters, which is the general question of what data do I want to synchronize, i.e. what do I want the content of the fields to be. Then you just add the filtering rules to match those business rules. Okay. For a database input connector like MySQL, on the other hand, you have some additional considerations. Number one would be, where in the data set do you want to start? Do you want to synchronize everything that exists already, or just start synchronizing from now going forward? Okay. The second thing you need to consider is, do you want to synchronize change data or just synchronize new records? So when using a connector like Salesforce, you don't need to worry about these types of things, because defining filters, because the connector itself is already looking after these particular concerns. It can do this. Salesforce connector and other SaaS connectors are able to do this because they understand the data model in question, whereas the data model in your data in your database is not something that Weave already understands. So first off, let's look at the common type of filtering rules that just concern themselves with the general question of what should the content of the fields and the records be that we want to synchronize. After that, we'll have a look at some of the filtering type rules that you need to consider for database specific questions, such as where do we want to start synchronizing data, and how do we want to handle change data or just new records. Okay, so the process of adding the actual rules is quite simple. You just go to the filtering tab, as I said already, and you press the add button here. So if, for example, we only want to synchronize based on a particular state, if you will, just want to say if the state is or is not equal to, and then you specify a value such as like CA for California or whatever. So that will only allow records through where the state is equal to California. Okay, so they're the most basic content-based filtering rules, if you like. So now let's look at the category of filtering rules that apply to database input connectors only. Okay, so these are the additional ones that you need to worry about with databases that you don't need to worry about generally with regular SaaS type connectors, because that's looked after for you in the connector itself. Okay, so if you don't specify any rules in the database connector, the connector will synchronize all records in the database in the table. Okay, so that's the first thing to consider. If you don't specify any rules for the likes of MySQL connector, all the records will get synchronized. As far as where will the synchronized start question goes, having no filtering rules will result in the connector synchronizing all the rows in the table. It will basically start at the beginning of the table and synchronize them all. As for whether it will sync only new records or will it sync new and change data, well, it'll actually synchronize both. It'll synchronize any new records coming through, and it'll synchronize across any changes that get applied to your rows in your database. So that's obviously the simplest setup, and it may be perfect for a relatively small table of lookup data. For example, if you've got like a product list that you want to synchronize over to Salesforce or whatever, you can do that quite easily with this. You don't need to specify any rules. So where you need to have more consideration then is where you've got larger data sets in your database. You're going to want to specify some filtering rules that will constrain the sync process in some way, such that your Weave integration is not constantly hammering the database, fetching huge data sets every time it queries. So there are two ways of doing this, and these basically depend on whether you want to just new records, or you want to you want new and updated records, i.e. change data. So if you just want new records that are added to your table, you're not interested, and you're not interested in synchronizing change data, then the simplest thing is to specify a rule that watches a sequence number, sequence field in your table. For example, an incrementing ID record number of some sort. Okay, so to do that, for example, in this case, we could watch the customer number here, and basically had a rule that says I only want to synchronize where the customer number is greater than. And you can, and here's the bit that's interesting. You can basically say, you don't need to specify a number here, you can actually specify greater than the last sync value. So it'll perform synchronizations, and it'll keep track of every record as it syncs it. And when it's making the query the next time, then it'll basically pick the customer number from the last successful sync that it did, and use that to build the query to query the next data set. So you're not querying the whole record, the whole table every time. Okay, so then if you want to synchronize both new and change data, then you need to filter in, or apply filters in a slightly different way. So you want to watch for something like a timestamp field. Okay, a field that gets updated on record for every insert and update on the table. So without something like this process will not be able to constrain the queries on the database. So this is important. So for with the table I've got here, what I have is a timestamp field, and I can basically add a rule like where the timestamp is greater than the last timestamp. So it's basically the same as the other like the ID synchronization, or where we only want to sync new records, but the difference is the type of field that you're actually synchronizing on. We're synchronizing on a field that gets updated. It's not a primary key that gets set on a record and can't be reused again. Okay, so that's the basic idea there. Of course, if you're using a timestamp, you may want to add a second rule that where it's equal to the last sync value as well, so you capture that window of overlap between queries. Okay.